Welcome, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started with our coffee equity conversation. And so just a little bit of housekeeping. I'm going to introduce our program for today, and then I'll hand it over to our moderator. But first, my name is Shatira Hall with the Coffee Equity Lab at Vanderbilt University, where I work with Dr. Ted Fisher and Haynes Montesinger to build programs and partnerships that support the pursuit of a more equitable coffee industry for all coffee actors through research, teaching, and practice. Thank you for joining us for our first of 4 coffee equity conversations we're hosting this fall. Over the past many months, we've had countless conversations with coffee professionals around the world about what we mean when we talk about equity in coffee. Repeatedly, access to information, education, and professional development has been raised as one of coffee's great equity challenges. Inspired by these conversations, this series explores how factors like geographic location, language, race, gender, ability, sexuality, and more prevent many coffee professionals around the world from accessing the information and education they need and desire to reach their fullest potential in the industry. Today, we're kicking our series off with a high-level exploration of this topic with moderator Vava Nguyen, founder and owner of Vava Specialty Coffee, panelists Vera Espindola Rafael, Director of Strategic Initiatives at Columbia-based Azura Coffee Company, Dr. Kate Fisher of the Honors College at the University of Colorado at Boulder, and co-creator of the Specialty Coffee Association Coffee Sustainability Program, and Margaret Kumundo, founder of Kahawa 1893 and third-generation Kenyan coffee farmer. Thank you all so much for being here. We're so excited for this conversation. As a bit of housekeeping, before I hand it over to Vava, we'll reserve ample time at the end of the webinar for your questions and comments. In the meantime, feel free to use the Q&A and chat feature to share reflections and questions during the conversation. If you need technical support, please direct message me, Shatira Hall, using the chat feature in your window. Last, we would like to share this webinar is being recorded and will be made publicly available after today's events. We'd also like to thank PJ's Coffee, New Orleans Roast, and the Center of Sakafina for helping make this series possible. With that, Vava, I would like to hand it over to you.
All right. Thank you for that, for the opening remarks, and thank you for having us. Today, I'm joined by a group of very strong and opinionated ladies. So before we sort of dive deep into this subject matter, I'd like to give an opportunity to each of the ladies joining me today to give a brief introduction of their backgrounds and what they do and who they are within the coffee sector before we kick this off. So perhaps starting off with Vera.
Thank you, Vava, and thank you, Shatira, for the invitation to be part of this discussion. My name is Vera Espindola Rafael. I'm a development economist. I'm based in Mexico City and currently working for Azura Coffee Company on their strategic initiatives. I've been working in coffee for the last 15 years, primarily on addressing the issues what we are seeing for producers, specifically in this case, economic issues, the piece on price, of course. And in the years, I've changed a bit in the sector. So I started with the Research Institute at Ana Cafe. From there, I moved on to an NGO from there for the government, which was a very interesting opportunity as well. And now for privates, I've been looking at the industry from different angles. I'm also currently serving the board of SCA and the Coffee Science Foundation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vera. Margaret, we'll have you next.
Margaret, I'm the founder of Kahawa 1893 Coffee. Kahawa means coffee in Swahili, and 1893 is when coffee was first commercially grown in Kenya. The company was founded with a mission to empower women producers, and that's inspired by my own experience growing up on a coffee farm, my grandfather's coffee farm in Kenya. And my experience there was seeing how women provided most of the labor, but didn't really get compensated. So our mission is to try and fix that with Kahawa 1893 through our business model.
All right, thank you, Margaret. Kate, can go next.
Yes, so thank you to everyone for this, what I'm sure is going to be a very exciting conversation. So I'm an anthropologist by training, a cultural anthropologist, and like a lot of people who grew up in non-producing, I got into coffee as a barista and started asking questions and was not satisfied with the answers I was finding online, pre-Google. And so went to school to learn more, and I still have questions. And I find that the more questions I find answers to, the more questions I get that follow up to that. So I teach classes in anthropology and women and gender studies, and my research has been in Central America, primarily in Costa Rica and now in Honduras, looking at all sorts of things from national identity in Costa Rica around coffee and coffee production, and now working with a group of smallholder farmers in Honduras and looking at the quality and processing and fermentation, and just overall always concerned with like what's going on in between some of these different spaces. So very excited to be here.
All right, thank you all for those introductions, and a little bit about myself before we dive into this conversation. Vava, been in the coffee industry a long time, I would say over a decade, and run a few enterprises within the coffee sector, but more so on the producer exporter side, and very passionate about education for coffee producers and accessibility for producers and producing countries. I'm honored to be moderating this conversation, and perhaps maybe how I got to be the moderator is because my anger always drives me to make a lot of noise, and positive noise in that. Also author of Coffee Milk Blood, a book that sort of dives into some of the things that have made me uncomfortable as a woman, and a woman from an African producing country, of how we're depicted as coffee producers oftentimes. So slowly also trying to change the narrative and how we're depicted when it comes to coffee marketing. So thank you all, folks who are attending this webinar today, and really excited to get into this conversation. I think a lot of us would sort of agree that there's really no formal, or there's really been no formal education in coffee. And when we perhaps were all starting our careers, it was more, you know, you pick, you know, your point of view and maybe just start learning on the job. And then slowly with time, there's been the need for developing common languages for us to understand each other from the producing side and from the consuming country side. Hence, the introduction of several curriculums and programs that we see across the sector. So before we start asking all the hard questions as to how we got to the point of inequity and a lack of proper dissemination of education and information, perhaps I'd want to start off with Kate, who is on the academic side of things, and ask, Kate, what do you think have been the positives so far within the industry, and what can we give ourselves a pat on the back in terms of what have we done right so far before we dive into what we're doing wrong?
Yes, I think there's a few things. One, and of course all of these things can turn negative, right? But I think specialty coffee in particular gets points for at least recognizing publicly these problems with, you know, inequalities, and, you know, however problematic some of that can be, there is, you know, time and space devoted to what are the problems in the industry and what are we going to do about it. And that's at, you know, SCA events, Specialty Coffee Association, and in other forums. You know, I don't know a whole lot about, say, sugar, but I don't see a whole lot of sugar advertising, talking about the people who grew sugarcane. So, is this good or bad? I think it can go both ways, but at least it's something. It's a place to start with. And I think things like SCA classes and CQI, the Coffee Quality Institute, they're a start. And as you said, Baba, they're trying to create some common language when we're all literally speaking different languages. And even if we're all speaking English or Swahili or Spanish or whatever it may be, coming to things with a different idea of what a term actually means. So like selectivity when it comes to harvesting, we might all have a definition for that, but what does that actually mean? And so I think those are a good place to start. And then having something to start with gives you something to work from and say, here's what's good about that model. Here's what needs, help. But then at least you have a thing, that you can work with or against, or, whatever the case may be, as opposed to just stuff. So I think those are a couple of the good things.
All right, Maggie, moving on to you in the same regard, because I think we all have to share what we feel is positive. As someone who has been in corporate America, Wall Street and the like, and now running your own enterprise and having some successes, what do you feel we've done right as a sector in this regard?
Yeah, and I realized I didn't give a protracted background about myself. So before I went back to coffee, I actually got my MBA and then went to work on Wall Street. I used to cover consumer industries, including coffee. So I was coming at coffee from that sort of educational standpoint, if you will. And so when I entered the sector and kind of realized the many ways that it was being approached, to me, what I found really interesting was, for instance, all the information that's out there about, how specific origins taste their coffee, appreciation for Kenyan coffee. And I was very, very excited to see names of farmers on bags. I thought that was really cool. And I was, I really wanted that. I wanted my cooperative that I worked with to be on the names of big coffee companies, which I accomplished. So like, Blue Bottle served our coffee. They had our coffee on their bags. And that was a project that I worked on with the farmers to educate them and do that. And to me, being able to take a cooperative that was unknown in Kenya, had never exported specialty coffee, to essentially bring it to one of the best companies in America at the time, I thought that was a great accomplishment. So I think there's some fulfillment that comes from seeing great talent be appreciated on that level. And another positive thing was information around brewing. Because with coffee, you can have the best coffee, unlike wine, which comes ready made and you just pour it, you can't really mess it up. Coffee, to really appreciate it, the last steps are as important as the first step, so brewing it. So I've really appreciated how we've disseminated brewing information, ratios, and all that kind of information to make sure that people can appreciate coffee. And I think that's actually one of the ways that we've grown the specialty coffee tent. Now specialty coffee is more than 50% of the market. And I think bringing that information and making it, to the mass market and making it more accessible has been one of the positives that I've really liked about the sector. You're on mute.
Sorry. So great. Positives always make us feel, I think, really good about, stuff. And Vera, from your point of view and your vast experience, NGO, government, private sector, what do you feel, what really stands out to you in terms of what we've done right as a sector?
I think it's a great question to start with. I was taking notes already. I really think that there, in both pieces on what Kate and Margaret mentioned, lies at the end the piece of having more insight into the coffee supply chain and having more information about what's going on, particularly when it comes to understanding the production side. And then having that more insight, having an understanding of what is actually then, what kind of actors do in the supply chain exist, what kind of other actors which you normally wouldn't think of are present in the sector and influence in some way the coffee supply chain. I think that has become more valuable. In a sense, there is more transparency, although we will get into the piece of where we need to focus on, where we need to work on more. But I do think that there is more insight and understanding about the coffee sector. So I think that we're not, maybe slowly, we're heading to that direction.
Right. All really good points to start us off. Now I want to straight up move on to asking, with what we have as current offerings for folks, you and I, producer populations, do we all feel that the current offerings are practical, both cost-wise and content-wise? And with the dissemination methods available, post-COVID, I mean, we're still in the COVID era. Do we feel that all of this is practical? I know that's like a loaded question, so feel free to just break it down a little, and whoever wants to take this one on first can jump right in.
I feel comfortable by taking it on. I thought quite some bit about this, specifically with this webinar, because I do think there are some pieces that we can focus on specifically. There's a piece of that development of content piece. There's a piece of the translation and making it available piece, and that access piece is very important when it comes to this topic. Now, when we're talking about the coffee supply chain in that sense, we see content being created by certain people for a specific part of the supply chain. And often, and Margaret pointed it out already, it is that part of the consumption side, and there is that part of the production and processing side, right? It's like two areas in that sense. When we're coming back to who creates it, for who it is made available and for who it's made, I think that there is already quite some chunk that we can talk a bit further, because I do think there is still some work to do on that front. And then we're not even have started about the access to that content for producing countries. And one of the things that I wanted to mention also on that is we have also divide these groups of people into producing country and consuming countries. And as you know, as many of the countries that produce also consume for centuries. And that is often being forgotten when it comes to making access of this education to these producing, consuming countries.
Yeah, so I'll go next. When I think about access, I always like to tie in resources with that, because if you have the information but you can't act on it, there's only so much you can do. And sort of speaking from sort of my own personal experience of working with cooperatives in Kenya, in my experience, for instance, just give you a story, is I was working on a transparency project, which is how do we trace coffee from the farm all the way to the cup. And I came back with all this fancy equipment of tracking and everything. And then to actually arrive at the cooperative and realize that their machine was broken down, right? So the machine that they need to process the coffee was broken down. So it felt so stupid that, I'd spent all this money on really fancy equipment to trace this journey and, to essentially, tell people where the coffee was coming from. But the farmers didn't have the most basic machine that they needed to process their coffee. So that made me really reflect on information, empowering someone with information that they can't use. And the second part was, so for instance, the cooperative that my cooperative back home is it has, produces some of the best coffees on the farm, but he's unable to process it correctly because, they have the knowledge, it's been passed down through generations, but they don't have the right, equipment to do it. They don't have the right incentives because they're not getting any price appreciation, whether you separate out the cherries, whether you ferment them correctly or not. You're getting the same price, so why bother? So I think when I think about access to information, it's pairing it with resources to implement that information, but also pairing it up with incentives to make sure that that information, how they use it, can be monetized in some way, or can help improve their circumstances. And another thing that I found really interesting was that when I started this women empowerment project, a lot of people wanted to fund the education part of it. They wanted to teach the women about equality and about empowerment. And I was very resistant to that idea because how can you teach someone about empowerment? It's just, to me, felt very interesting. It was like, you empower someone by giving them the resources and information they need, but you can't teach empowerment, you can't teach equality. That's something that manifests because of all the other things that surround them. So that's how I think about access to information.
All right, thanks, Maggie. And you point out, I think, 3 key things there, which is access, resources, and incentives. Because oftentimes I also feel that farmers are told produce organic coffee, but nobody wants to pay for the organic certification, whereas farmers do practice regenerative farming, but the Western world does not recognize regenerative farming because you're African, maybe they just need a stamp on or it doesn't matter, it's Africa, it's Latin America, but nobody believes you unless you have the USDA organic certification or some other thing that is a barrier to entry or a barrier to you actually accessing what we're saying could be these incentives. Farmers do want to do better. Farmers do want to diversify income, but oftentimes, and farmers are quite knowledgeable because they hustle to get this knowledge. They notice that climate is changing. And despite the lack of resources to actually educate themselves and do things, they actually go out of their way, do what they can to actually survive, because at times it's survival for the fittest. So Kate, what are your thoughts about current offerings that we have as an industry, and are they practical? And I'd like for someone to touch on cost as well.
Oh, this is like a whole week-long conversation just by itself. But I think the sort of short version, absolutely, to both Vera and Maggie's points about particularly, being able to act on what you have. You can have the most beautiful coffee in the whole world, but if it just gets thrown into a container with everything else and you're not getting paid anything more for it, why on earth would you bother, right? Like, that's not a rational choice. So in terms of thinking about some of the formal, education type offerings, and that idea of certifications too, I think falls into that, right? Yeah, you absolutely, if you're going to sell something as organic, you need a stamp, and you might need several stamps if you're going to sell it in several countries. And you need, people from outside to come in and tell you that what you're doing is right or wrong. And that can be a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of money. And again, a lot of chances for people just to be doing this when they're talking, even if they're, again, literally speaking the same language. It's, I know right here I'm preaching to the choir, but for those of you listening, it's much murkier than it looks like when you see a list of requirements for different kinds of certifications. There's a lot more room for interpretation. And so with those, I think kind of like what I think about a lot of the formal SCA or CQI type programs is, I think that they are positive when they're a starting point, and when they're a point that we can look at and say, okay, here is this class on becoming a Q grader. So you're going to learn how to you're not going to learn how to taste coffee because you have to know some of that to take that class and be successful at it. But you're going to learn the standardized language and you're going to learn the standardized protocols so that the best that we currently can, when people taste coffee in different parts of the world, speaking different languages and with, different palates, we're at least mostly talking about the same things in the same way. It's not perfect, but at least there's something there, because there's so many ways that can vary. Even things like on the processing side with the new CQI processing programs, I say washed coffee. That sounds like it's very specific, but it's really not. It really doesn't tell you as much as might appear that it tells you, or we might have different ideas about what exactly has gone into producing a washed coffee or a natural, or don't even get me started on honey as a designation. But those things are, as you mentioned, Mama, those are costly. Those are expensive classes. And they're not just expensive in terms of the cost of registering, but they're often long. Some of them can be a week long, and now you've got to stay somewhere and you've got to eat and you've got to get there and you've got to not be doing other things for work. And who can invest in that? And then who has, I don't want to say education broadly, but I mean a specific kind of education, which is generally formalized, used to taking standardized type tests and thinking about things in a kind of very, I mean disciplined in the sense that you've learned how to do it the way that teachers want you to do. Those are people who can pass these sorts of tests and, write out the answers. Whereas your farmer who was only able to go to third grade is probably more knowledgeable, but can't express it in a way that can show up on a multiple choice test. Because they haven't ever had to learn how to do that, or haven't been able to, depending on what we're talking about. But with COVID, I think we've seen some changes in some of this. We're having this conversation from 5 different places really with Shatira, right? Different continents, different time zones. And we could have done this pre-COVID, and we did occasionally, but there is, for people who are able to have internet access that is stable enough to handle this kind of connection, there's been a lot of classes that have been offered online. And it's, maybe it's not as great as being able to talk to people in the same room, but it's a long shot better than nothing. It's a lot cheaper. It doesn't take travel costs. It's still not open to people without internet access or with shoddy internet, but it's a push for that. And so my last thing before I ramble too much is, as one of the creators of the sustainability program, we thought a lot about this, and I don't think it's remotely enough. What we've done with that SCA series of courses, I think we knew it as we were doing it, that we were hoping it would be a starting point for hopefully more people to take up and say, here's what's needed, here's what's not, how do I do this? Because right now it's not useful for everybody at all.
Okay, you end with a very crucial point there, because we realize this business, calling it a business model from an entrepreneurial standpoint, it's not working, because otherwise we would not be having this discussion. And a sector, or I'd like to refer to maybe the American school system, where we realize, charter schools sometimes don't work, or the educational system in the US doesn't work. So a lot of things have been done to try and sort of rectify that. But I'm like, why are we so afraid as an industry to take next steps? Of course, I see private sector intervention with where we have interests as private enterprises, me included, in developing curriculums that will help the populations that we work with, because I don't want to lose out on a group of producers that I'm sourcing from. I want to keep them up to par with the new trends. I want to invest, but that costs small companies a lot of money. If you're a multinational, of course, you can afford this kind of sort of budget allocation, which could be marketing / what do they call it? There's a popular NGO word, which is capacity building. which I think is an overused word. And I think we should be more practical with what this capacity is, because this capacity building doesn't seem to last long enough in communities. So we keep capacity building every now and then with no real results. So if this business model is really not serving, especially one side of the population that is really the ones that are producing the crop that we're all here for, what then, and perhaps this question should be left to the end. This could be a rhetorical question at this point in terms of like, but I would move to ask, where should we then allocate resources to be more effective as an industry when we're looking at what we can do better? And Maggie, perhaps pointing to you right now is, as someone who's worked on Wall Street, recently had a lot, you were all over on the papers with first, I would say, is it African brand in trade, sorry?
Black and woman owned.
Yeah, Black and woman owned brand at Trader Joe's. And, so do you think that we are putting money in the wrong places in this sector? Do you think there's money that is being allocated, for example, on the consumer side too much, where we're doing research on equipment and espresso extraction, as opposed to how can we have producers increase production, remain hopeful by putting more money in their pockets, and just equitable distribution of resources? So is the money going in the wrong places, and what can we do about resource allocation?
Yeah, that's a really loaded question, I have to say. So for me, and this is something that has evolved over time. When I first joined the industry, I was sort of coming from that, my own experience and experience of the farmers that I work with, which is a smallholder farmer with only a handful of trees, who's at the mercy of whatever the market is throwing at them, right? So trying to survive. And I think now, I've been in the industry almost 5 years now, as a roaster, and we recently launched in Trader Joe's, big grocery chain, and we'll be launching in other national chains later this month. I think I can say it. We'll be launching in Target and Fresh Market and other national chains. So I'm actually now seeing the business from another perspective, which is when you're sourcing kind of larger volumes, you start to see the coffee business from a different perspective from when you're a small specialty roaster. You care about very different things. And the things that I used to think 2 years ago, now I'm looking at them from a very, very different perspective. And so to your question, Bava, in terms of like how, when you see a lot of money being poured into equipment, when you see people willing, to spend $20,000 on equipment, but not willing to pay more than $1 on the coffee, it can be a little bit, it can be very, very confusing, because, and also hurtful, right? Because when I explain to people about what it actually takes to produce coffee, a whole year of tending to the crop, the processing, the transport, the risks, all of that to get $1 a pound. And it's crazy, right? Versus on the equipment side, on the brewing side, people really are willing to spend as much as possible. So how do we bring that sort of willingness to spend onto the coffee side? And I think there's two ways of looking at it, right? There's the willingness to pay, which is are consumers actually willing to pay, right? And then if they're willing to pay, why is the market not giving them an opportunity to? And side note, that's why we have a tipping option. So in our product, we have a QR code and you can tip the farmer. And that was the approach of like, if consumers are willing to pay more because they're willing to pay more for equipment and they're willing to pay more for other things, it's just that the market is not giving them an opportunity to pay for that. So that's why we have a tipping option where you can pay more for farmers if you'd like. But I mean, I think it's really sad, but I think it comes down to, again, just just incentives. I think again, for equipment manufacturers, they just have better marketing budgets, right? To push that farmers really don't. So that's the unfortunate, it's the unfortunate reality of the situation.
True, Margaret, I hear you. However, we are in producing countries, a lot of us are not consuming enough of this coffee. There is consumption happening in producing countries, but not to the level of consuming all the coffee that is produced. So we look to importers, we look to consuming countries to buy this coffee.
Yeah.
So why not, and with, say, production in a country like Kenya falling by 62% over the last couple of years, and with Kenya being like a prime, producing country in terms of what we offer. I mean, our processing methods, the quality of the coffee and all of that. So when you're talking about incentives, the incentive for me would be, I mean, if producers are not paid more, they will stop producing coffee. There will be no more coffee from Kenya. People will sell land for real estate, which is happening in Kenya. I mean, nobody wants to be poor. I mean, poverty, we keep talking about poverty eradication in developing countries. None of us wants to be poor. I don't want to sell my business because I can no longer be a coffee exporter, but sometimes we're driven to those points. And I'm not trying to put anyone on the spot right now, but you have been perhaps at the forefront as a roaster in the US, seeing what the demand for your coffee has been, both at Trader Joe's and opening national accounts at other grocery stores. So, and of course, fortunately, you've grown up in a producing country, so you have that empathy side of seeing what producers go through. But I think for me, it's something that baffles me how we will drive a sector to the ground, and maybe at the end of the day, maybe, I don't know, we'll just be buying commodity coffee, or I don't know. But Vera, what are your thoughts on this as well? But maybe Maggie, you have a
yeah, I wanted to add that, like, this is me again, I just talking from sort of a big roaster perspective, which is focusing on today, and not like they're worrying about tomorrow, right? But they're focused on extracting the biggest value today, because we already have coffee made in a lab. There's a company that's producing coffee in a lab. For all we know, in 10 years, that's a backup source for coffee companies. It's like, okay, there's no more coffee coming from Kenya. We can reproduce that same characteristics in a lab. So I think that's another thing that where farmers are getting competition from a lab, right? From lab grown coffee. How should we think about that as well? But sorry to interrupt, Vera.
No, I think that the discussion, what we're seeing here, goes back to the topic of this conversation, where it goes back to the fact that we are looking ways to add value to the producer in that sense, mostly because it's there where we see poverty. We don't see necessarily poverty at another end. It's there where also specifically farm workers, as well as workers in the service industry, come to play, because it's there where we also see hints of poverty. In the case of specifically when it comes to education, it's education gives value to a person, and that's undebatable. For me, it's also okay, so if we want to give that education to this group of people, how do we do that? And okay, we have content that has already been created, but the content at one point is also created ads in certain countries, which are primarily consuming countries, and they are in that sense the gatekeepers of providing this education to the rest of the sector, to the rest of the world. What we talked about, the cost, is a very valid point, because how is it possible that certain people in certain countries, let's say an agronomist or that wants to go into cupping, or a barista that wants to go into cupping, currently in producing countries, they don't have the same opportunities as a person in a traditional consuming country, being Europe or the US. So for me, it's key that that's being addressed and that's being talked about, because we do not have the same standard of living in these countries versus as in those countries. And it's in those countries where the content is created. It's in those countries where the amount of how much does it cost to enter this course is being defined. And if we do not address this will not change. And I'm not even then discussing still that material is not translated into our languages. So in that sense, it is sometimes people that are basically either volunteering to translating certain material. It is also sometimes about looking and just copy pasting it in Google Translate and then having the information that's full. It's again a bottleneck. You overcame the first bottleneck. Okay, maybe you get a certain level of English, great. Then the second one, oh, it's costly to get it. Okay, you overcome that. So it is for me sometimes as if we need to really put ourselves into the position of people that want to access that information. And we're not doing that. We're not doing a good enough job in 2022 with all the resources that exist, with all the knowledge that exists and investigation that exists to make this affordable and accessible to the majority of the sector.
Vera, that's a really, really good point. I think when you were speaking, something that popped in my head was about how do we try and disseminate existing information? And also, how do we kind of rethink new ways of doing things, right? So right now, in the coffee industry, it's being held by a lot of sort of practices from colonial period. There's a lot of myths, a lot of best practices, which are holdovers from the colonial period, right? That we're disseminating. So as you were talking about being able to translate and bring that information, I was thinking about how do we also, sort of people in developing countries, how do we kind of disseminate our information as superior? So not just being recipients, but how do we also say, look, this is like, we're from Kenya, we're from, right next to Ethiopia, this is the original information. How do we make our information sort of authoritative as well? And
exactly
bring it to the world?
Exactly. It's the recognition. We're talking about previously about the certification piece, which is often developed in, again, consuming countries where we adhere by their requirements, and that's developed somewhere in the tower in a country that we do not know, dictating certain requirements to us, so we need to comply by. The same is true for research or material that's being developed in producing countries, but not sufficiently recognized because they do not understand what that research institute is or what it does or how was it developed. So hence, they cannot curate, in a sense, the content that's being created in these countries as well. And I think that that's also a bottleneck, because we do have, as you rightly said, efforts as being made to create that content, but it's simply not acknowledged as such. The same as certain events where people are like, oh, it's an event, it's just an event in a producing country. It's not that valuable. Where I would say the events that's being sometimes organized in our regions are of huge value for us, maybe not for you, but for us it is. So I do think that recognition needs to be much more understood and much more be the work that's being done by researchers in our region needs to be recognized much more. And I know for a fact that in the region, specifically in Mesoamerica, there is fantastic research being done by students that simply just lies there and nobody pays attention to.
Yeah.
Thanks. And to your point,
Spanish.
Sorry, Kate.
I was saying this, right, then that's in Spanish, and oh, that's really hard, right? How could that possibly since it's in Spanish? Which goes back to that question of language and like who's sort of willing who's willing, I think, to put in the work. Or like stuff that comes out of Sunny Cafe, right, in Colombia is incredible.
Yeah.
And then, Bava, I want to turn your question almost upside down, because you're asking is how can we get access to information that's already there, and then how do we get value? So one of the things that I found really interesting about the coffee industry and how roasters extract value from consumers is by educating them about certain things, right? That they should care about and pay for, right? But those things are arbitrary. So roasters have picked certain elements that they can control and added value to them. So one way that, farmers or people from developing countries can create value on the consumer side is to be able to kind of focus on those things that are farmer-centric, that can be replaced, right? So I'll give you an example of essentially how people talk about Kenyan coffee sometimes, which is the variety. So you'll hear people saying like Batian is not good. It doesn't taste good, right? But Batian it's a variety of coffee. So roasters will be like, oh, I won't touch Batian, it's inferior. I'll only touch SL28. But the truth is, Batian is as good, but it's better for farmers because it has better yield. It's, disease resistance. It grows fast. So you go from this point where, roasters are pushing consumers to appreciate the SL28, rightfully so, but the Batian is just as good, but it's actually really good for farmers, right? But who needs to tell consumers that story? Who needs to tell consumers whether to care about geisha or to care about, whoosh whoosh, or to care about a certain variety? So that storytelling sits on the hands of roasters, and the storytelling is focused on differentiating. So pushing the narrative on things that they can differentiate on and get value, right? That doesn't necessarily translate to farmers. So part of the work that I try and do is try and focus the narrative towards where farmers can get the most value out of as well. So that's another way that we can add value.
Yeah, and this moves me to the point of technology, and I mean, all great points that I agree with. And I've had this SL28 story in Kenya till it exhausts me because people don't understand why a producer will grow Ruru 11, Batian, and whatever, and they're like, if it's not SL, you guys are losers. Why did Kenya stop growing so much SL28? And I'm like, you're not paying us more to, and then you want us to go organic and then still spray the coffee, and it's not really disease resistant. I mean, what I say is that some importers and some roasters have, what is it called? Beer pallets? No, they have champagne pallets, but beer pockets. Yeah. So, which brings me to the discussion around technology, and everyone has touched on dissemination. The Coffee Research Institute in Kenya, I would say, has done massive work. Like, I know some phenomenal professors and people who've done amazing work that is not even out there yet. And I came across someone who worked, privately, because sometimes some importers and roasters invest their own money and come up with publications that really blow your mind. And you're like, wait a minute, this guy's in Kenya and he knows all of this, and I've never met him. And I've been struggling to get this information, because I remember when I was trying to do my thesis in coffee and then just could not find information, and then just sort of gave up, and I was like, maybe I'll pursue this as a long-term entrepreneurial venture. So tech. And I think we cannot get away from technology in as much as it has its, downside and upside, but I think it's got more upsides, especially in the age where we've been limited in how we communicate with field teams and how we communicate. I mean, you at some point during lockdowns, you could not go to farms and everything. So your tech levels, I mean, you have to be on communicating with farmers. They have to learn the apps, people have to be tech savvy. But then again, technology cannot fix inequality. Because I think with the need for more tech, we've also realized during COVID how inequitable all of this is. Let me not even touch on children in homes where there's no Wi-Fi and how parents have to invest in Wi-Fi, and your producers who also don't have access to constant, good Wi-Fi. So of course, the need for tech has also shown us how inequitable this sector is in terms of who has what. So, but I feel that with the need for, there's a necessity to fuse agriculture with technology. And for me, that's the future for Africa and Latin America and any other producing country. but we need to train and provide more opportunities, coupled up with the technology. Now, Vera, with your experience having worked at, Rainforest, an NGO, the Mexican government, and now with a private enterprise, how do you feel, what role do you feel government, private sector, and the NGO sector can play in elevating some of these issues that we're talking about here today?
Oh, wow. So it just resonated quite a bit what you just said to me about, in a sense, technology does not solve inequity. In a sense, it pushes in some level to it, because apparently technology needs to provide transparency. With transparency, you have more access. Hence, we still see bottlenecks. And I think it's there where we always have discussed and talked within the coffee sector, collaborating. Private sector, PPPs, that's the way to go. But we often also see that there is some level of responsibility and accountability for each of these actors within the chain. Is it for an NGO? Is it for the government? Is it for a private company? We all have a role to play. We often also are sometimes disconnected, in a sense. We often sometimes think that by visiting once or twice a country, we know and understand the issues. That's not true. You will not know fully a country unless you actually have spent X amount of time and understood and are engaging with the majority of the people, right? And I think in a way, the government has its own issues within that. The government, as with particular with working with the Mexican government, we have always looked into what are the pieces which we can work on and who can support us with that. And then the interesting thing is that sometimes you have these certain companies that said, oh, we do not want to work with these governments because they are not similar governments as ours, or they are known for having a certain level of, let me just say the word corruption, which in a sense is a piece of truth in there. It's not. But it is in a way that I think, well, we sometimes need to work with what we have. We sometimes need to just use the systems that are being created and see, okay, what can I use within this current system and what can I create out of this certain system, correct? And I think the out is where there is a huge opportunity for also to come in and say, okay, how can I take this and make this also more available or accessible to more people? For example, we talked about it, the cost of certain courses that is, and the way and how you can develop yourself as a professional with these courses. They have a lot of bottlenecks, but I don't hear any private entity talk about this, not private roasters that talk about, oh, hey guys, great, I got the course, I could afford it, but maybe we should also think about other people in these countries. It's sometimes that we need to do a combined effort of raising our voices more about these issues so that we can actually come up with a solution that is, carried by the whole sector. And it's there where I think also government can play a role, these institutions can play a role, and the private sector can play a role. But we often sometimes also only look for our own constituency.
Thanks for that response. And to, I think, sort of maybe kind of ask back and also rope in Kate on this one, because I think research plays a role in a lot of this. But I'm just wondering, with all the research dollars that we've seen out there, and how can we make a lot of this research results and reports that we get, how do we make them actionable? How do they become practical rather than just white papers that people have to read and then what next, So I think, Kate, to you, that question first, and then if Vera and Margaret, if you have a response to that, because I'm like, I love academia, to be honest. I love learning. I mean, I was once in that direction, but I'm just like, we need to be more practical because, we're not here forever. So how do we make the research dollars count?
There's a question. So I think, some of this goes to one of your earlier points about like, where is there funding and research? And there's a lot of funding relatively. Coffee is dramatically underfunded in terms of research and investments. And I think a huge part of that goes to the point that everybody's been making about it's a colonial crop. And it is outside of, Hawaii and now some experimental farms in California, it's not grown in the wealthier, dominant parts of the world. And so there's a lot relatively of funding for things like, grind size and temperature and total dissolved solids and what is the shape of this brewer basket, because it's sponsored by companies. And then those companies, they have a vested interest in knowing some of this stuff. And then they have stuff that they can sell. So, there's sort of part of their marketing budget, to Maggie's point, or some of their, research and development budget goes to this kind of work, where there's not a single company of any kind that can make money off of understanding, I don't know, like meaning and value in an X producer community. It doesn't get monetized, right? Because not only is this a colonial crop, it's like the impeccable capitalist crop. It has to get sold or traded, because you cannot, I've tried, and you cannot survive on coffee alone, right? Like it's a food that doesn't have nutritional value, has other values, absolutely, but not nutritional. So the funding goes in that direction. And then the funding for things like what I do, which is try to pull these different pieces together and have some of that, long-term research in a single place, but also see some of this bigger picture and do some of this. The funding that I get, my job is not a research specific position. And so there's some funding from the university, but it's very little. University doesn't have a lot of funding. University does get funding, again, from like private entities, because the way our government is funding research and institutions is a problem. So all these things come back to these much broader questions that are way bigger than the coffee itself. And I think this goes to some of Veda's point about working together. Like, some of these things are not the job of private companies or or things like that. And maybe some of that work that bigger institutions like SCA does, SCA can't tell people this is the price for coffee, right? It's not allowed. It's illegal for them to do that. It's price fixing. But they could potentially, and I know this is not an easy ask, right? Use like clout to, to think about, government, and in other countries too, right? Like, what is the job of government is a big question. What is the job of the private sector, of nonprofits, of individuals? But a lot of it then ends up being in the hands of individuals to try to solve these problems. And it ends up being one-off stuff, or people who are like, I've been to Origin. Which, if you want to make me really angry, tell me that you've been to Origin as a coffee roaster, and thus you can talk about this stuff. And I'm like, so you went to Ethiopia? Is that what you mean? No, it means you went to some place that grows coffee, and then it all gets flattened, right? It's all just Origin, as opposed to these wildly different spaces and hugely different histories and lived experiences and needs and things like that, all of which is super hard to fit on your bag of coffee. So, props for paying attention to that stuff, but then, I take away points if I'm going to be grading things, for all of this flattening that happens. So back to the research question, I think there's a lot of, I don't know how willful it is, but there's certainly ignorance, or kind of a lack of, maybe there's a lack of will in like doing those hard things. Like, oh, this paper is in Spanish. Like, gosh, I don't speak Spanish. Like, well, first of all, why do you only speak one language? But second of all, Google Translate can get you the gist of that. It's not going to do a great job, but it'll get you the ideas. It'll get you the concepts. And there are plenty of people who do speak Spanish or Swahili or, French or Portuguese or whatever the language is that this stuff is happening in. And they're out there. And we're not, that hard to find, whether it's anthropologists or people like you all, or researchers in other places or students or, it's there. Just like the ability to not pay the C price is there, but you have to do it. And I give kind of to the first question about what's good. I give points for a lot of this stuff, but I'm now done giving points for just talking. Like, there are no more points for being aware of issues. Now I want to see action.
Thanks, Kate. And I feel like this is the right time because I don't think we can go more than halfway during this conversation without mentioning that. I mean, Margaret, you mentioned it, and I think a lot of you sort of have talked about the colonial underpinnings within this sector. And I think the more information you keep away from your constituents that you're trying to have power over, the better it is. And I feel ever since I started my career in coffee is that we chase our own tails. Like, we talk and talk, we say that we want to do better, but then we kind of just hit the, you hit your head on the wall and you're like, oops, we can't do better because some reason. And I feel it's the Western world that still wants to put producers under their, under your heels so that you can have control, so that you can have power. Because I look at all the systems that we succumb to and all the rules and regulations. Unfortunately, yes, we don't drink that much coffee in Kenya. I mean, in as much as Ethiopia consumes a lot of coffee, they still export. But I like the fact that Ethiopia has put a fight, and people say all kinds of things about Ethiopia, but I'm glad that, in as much as people say Ethiopia is backward or whatever, everyone wants an Ethiopian coffee at the end of the day. And there's a lot of Ethiopian coffee out there in the US and other places. But I feel like there's the need to romanticize poverty, and there's a need to perpetuate this colonial notion that producers do not know what they want. And I feel that's why we are where we are, because we are all, I mean, most of us who we've interacted with in conference, I mean, you're all educated people who know to do better. We all claim to be ethical. We all claim to want to do better, but we don't do better. Even those institutions that go certifying producers and everything, there's question marks around what the certifications, are really about. Are they just businesses, or is there something that they're really benefiting? Because I mean, when you find two big bodies merging together, there was a need for one to be eradicated for some reason. I mean, these are things that we have to ask on the ground as to, are producing countries forever going to be asking for scholarships for young people to take courses in the coffee industry? Are we forever going to be leaning towards our roasters or importers to help us get a leg up? Because then we're still colonized. So I think we're still a very colonial sector. So which takes me to my next question around the need to invest in local talent, because we cannot forever have sectors run in Kenya, in Tanzania, run by expatriates. And Margaret, when we had a session a couple of days ago, you mentioned when you came to Kenya and you were, sort of baffled by, how many of these multinationals just have rooms of white people who are taking in all the knowledge and leaving nothing behind, and how perhaps there's just very little local talent that is being bred to take over. So what do you see, or what, I mean, I'll just throw this question out there and be like, yeah, Margaret, I don't know if you want to take it up, but the need to invest in local talent and to ensure continuity in the face of growing the local coffee industry, but just continuity, because and I don't know if government has a role to play, or private sector. We all have a role to play and things to say about this, I think.
I just would like to say that I heavily agree with that. We have to invest in local talent. We have to, and it's because there are already so many professionals in our countries present that have the knowledge. It's simply sometimes not sufficiently recognized as such. Going back to the point of we're only seen as producing countries, we do not have a voice when it comes to on a century perspective, on a roasting perspective, on a cupping perspective. It's there where our voice is less acknowledged in, right? And I would say we have great and fantastic roasters here. Maybe we have a different palette. That's a different discussion. We have great cuppers, we have great roasters, we have great baristas, we have great cafe owners. We have that and much more. And I do think that in that sense, in the international events, that's less spotlighted on. And I think that we can make an effort to also bring that much more in, so we can highlight the talent that we already have, but keep investing it, and keep investing it is in their education, making that more accessible. And I do think that in a sense, those bottlenecks what we talked about the cost is a valid one, because a lot of baristas want to take courses. It's not that they don't want to, it's simply they can't.
Yeah, I mean, very, very great points, Vaver and Val, there about investing in local talent. I was telling the team that I was kind of jarred by, in Kenya, all the trading, everything after the coffee leaves the farm, all of that becomes the work of, like, it's all foreign. No locals are involved after the coffee leaves the farm, which is very, very jarring. But also it just, you see not just like a gender change. So race and gender have such an interesting interplay in coffee. So you see a change from the farm where you have the women, they give it over, and then the men take over on the trading side. And then from the men, it goes straight to, it becomes all very, very foreign. And part of that is, going back to the gender question is, I was actually yesterday, I stumbled upon this article that I thought was really interesting. It was talking about how things that women like become devalued very quickly. So that's another thing to think about. So it gives the example of rosé. If you know rosé wine, it's kind of considered to be a feminine wine. It's also, it's not a respected wine in the wine industry because women like it. So anything that women like becomes very quickly devalued. And if you look at the specialty coffee industry, look at things that are expensive. The coffees that are expensive are the coffees that men like. They all go towards sort of men's palates, right? Things that women like are actually devalued, whether it's frappuccinos or, things that we like are devalued. And that's a whole different story, but it's actually at the core of education. It's at the core of what do we tell people to like, what do we tell people to value, right? We're telling people to value all the male-centric elements of coffee because that's what's valuable. So that's one element. And then the second thing, which I mentioned earlier, Vera, when I think about the future, when I think about bringing in younger talent and local talent, I think one of the things that I really would love is to play to our strengths. I think we are constantly trying to catch up to this game that we've been given to play. So we're constantly trying to run the rules to be the best at that game, but you can't play someone else's game and win. You need to create your own game with your own rules. So as we think to reinvent the coffee industry, we need to create new rules because we can't win some other people's game. It's an old game, we're late to it, we don't have enough resources. We need to change the game and like re-educate consumers about what they should care about and what's valuable. And so for me, and that's part of what I try and do is to make sure I'm not playing lip service to the old guard, to essentially say that's bullshit. This is actually that's a myth. This is the new way of thinking about things. And I think that's how we can invite new people and new talent and give them the permission to think about new things, to create new innovations that can excite the market. So that's how I think about keeping the new generation excited about coffee. On the processing side in Kenya, I'm seeing new, younger people really excited about processing because that's exciting because no one just wants to pick coffee, right? They want to come into coffee and be excited about the science and all of that. So giving them an opportunity to feel like they can get paid for the value that they're adding at each level.
That's part of like the bigger question too, of just, why aren't people continuing coffee? Like, besides the price, which is obviously a huge part of that, like, why would I do this if I'm going to be poor or lose money doing it? is that like, how is it valued, you know, as a profession? And, you know, what is it that I'm doing and what is exciting about it? And, you know, this should be seen as like, wow, awesome, like that's great, right? And it's often not. And I dream sometimes about a worldwide coffee producer strike, in which nobody sells any coffee and says, no, we're done taking prices here, right? We're not gonna like let you people who are buying it dictate the price. We're gonna be like any other business, and we're gonna tell you what the price is. And it's gonna be a price that covers our costs and lets us, you know, make some money. And just like anybody does, if you're gonna open a coffee shop or, you know, whatever business, you set the prices. And, you know, then we're going to have a whole reset, change the game. Like, why, you know, why, I know why coffee producers have to take prices. It's because it's colonial and extractive. But, you know, there's very few industries in which you just sit there and you wait for the buyer to tell you how much you're going to get. Like, that's so sideways to how this should work. You know, like, no, I have a fine coffee, and like a fine wine, you are going to pay me a fine price for it. So that's sometimes my dream. It's a global strike, but who can actually, right?
I have the same dream, Kate, and I don't know when that's going to happen, but it's going to happen slowly. As Margaret says, that, you know, play your own game, set your own rules, and, you know, put your foot down, and then the old guard will slowly realize, hopefully, because then again, coffee is a very capital intensive sector. So as much as we talk, you know, it's the you know, the piper that pays, that runs the show. So there's a lot to talk about on this and why we are where we are. But just before we go into the Q&A, I just want to ask each of you to just point out what you feel are practical short-term steps. I know you've sort of mentioned them here and there as you've been talking, but if you could say one or two things that are actionable, that stakeholders, whatever part of the chain you're in, that each of the stakeholders can take some actionable steps that can create, you know, movement forward rather than backward, and have an impact, a positive impact. Just one or two things before we go into the Q&A session. So I don't know who wants to go first. Maybe Kate, since you're on the screen.
Wait, Vera, raise her hand.
Oh, Vera.
I wrote them down actually.
Okay, great.
So I was listening to you and I wrote them down. So let's create more spotlight on the work produced in our countries as well. So it's great that work is being, you know, highlighted from the sector in general, from the international sector in coffee, but specifically when you can, just give the spotlight from work that you have seen from that's being produced in our producing countries as well. Even if it's just the sensory or roasting level, we do cool stuff, guys. Also push, even if you speak perfectly English, push for work to be done also in other languages. We're all part of this community, and I support sometimes also things that are not for me necessarily. Let's think for the other persons out there. And one for myself that I'm working on is I want to create my own events, you know, for the region. So where everybody of you is, of course, also invited. But that's for me that I'm taking with me for the next, it's a midterm thing that I want to do in 2 years.
Yeah, anthropologists are not known for their practicality, but to that, you know, kind of, I don't know how actionable, but I think so much of this comes back around to kind of what Vera was saying, like, you know, I do things that aren't just for me, is this viewing of so much as, you know, oh, this is just, you know, my problem, or it's like, oh, we have to look at sustainability in producing countries. And, you know, well, who are the ones contributing the most to climate change? It is, you know, not rural Honduras, let me tell you, right? It's by far the United States. So you could say, okay, recycle, you know, drive your car less. But I would say an actionable thing that combines a lot of this would be more about pressuring, you know, the bigger actors, whether that's a corporation, whether that's your government, whether that's local or bigger, you know, asking them what they're doing and pushing for that kind of stuff to change, because yes, individual change is super important and it's part of the bigger story and it's part of how momentum gets started. but this has to be bigger than me recycling, or me not taking my car one day. So that's my action, is pressuring other entities or getting other people to work along with you.
I want to actually spotlight one organization. It's called Get You Some Gear. And they're doing something very actionable, which is getting equipment to marginalized communities. So some baristas didn't even have, brewing equipment at home. So this organization is like, okay, we're going to get you a brewer, going to get you a grinder so you can practice. So that's like a very actionable way of bridging that gap between, access and information that I've seen, in the US locally. And then on the producer side, I think that there's sometimes small things that, roasters can do to help, but there isn't sort of an easy way to get involved, right? So people think that you have to undertake a big project to have impact, right? Versus you can help one co-op, for instance, like replace their machine, or help one co-op, replace their drying bed, right? So thinking of like small things, or like help the, one cooperative do X and Y. So thinking kind of how small actions can produce big results. And then my last point is actually something that Kate alluded to, which is about pressuring the big actors. So one of the things that frustrated me when I first entered the coffee industry was how everyone, in a way, was sort of like big actors set the stage in terms of like, these are the rules of coffee. And then everyone falls in line and kind of sings the same song. So we say, okay, this is ethically sourced coffee. It has these certifications. This is the playbook. Everyone play by it. And then you basically see every coffee company basically playing the same music and almost validating this idea of, this is ethically sourced coffee, when it's not ethical. It's not ethical because farmers are not paid. And so for me, I almost want people to stop using the word ethically sourced, because no coffee is ethically sourced, unless you actually paid the right price. So I actually don't use that word in reference to my coffee, because the coffee is not ethically sourced, really. Like, it's not. So my desire, as apart from the strike, is to see people stop to sing, because what we're doing is we're validating big actors that have set their agenda and that, frustrating farmers. And the rest of the specialty coffee industry, as much as we're making progress, we're paying lip service. We're actually helping to echo that message that the farmers are okay. The farmers are not okay. They're surviving. And I think we need to be able to say, look, the farmers are not okay. This coffee is not ethically sourced. If you need it to be ethically sourced, this is what you have to do. So that's kind of my last message.
Thanks, Maggie. And thanks for that strong point. But I'll tell you, our coffee is ethically sourced at Baba Coffee, for sure. People hate me for selling my coffee at the price I sell it at, but I say, if you're not going to pay this price, I'm not selling. And I've had fights with importers who think, I don't know, we're on some high horse, but I've built relationships with producers my entire career, and I never want to disappoint producers. And these are people I know personally over the years. So some people can use the word, but I do agree with you in terms of some words I used which shouldn't be. And to actually put a stamp on your coffee and say you're ethical, you're B Corp, you've definitely taken a beating because you're not playing according to everyone else's rules. So we stick out like a sore thumb, and some of the practical steps I've taken as an individual are paying better prices, really building relationships with producers, telling stories from our point of view, not the point of view of what other people are telling us they want to see. I'm telling the story of Kenyan coffee the way, as a young person, with the dignity that it deserves. And I would like that as producers, we stop taking everything that's thrown at us and challenge what you're told, because you're more knowledgeable, you've been exposed. And I thank the fact that I got to learn about the Western world early on and sort of pick what I liked and do away with what I don't like and use that for my benefit. But I'd also like to wind up by saying, I think as an industry, we need to take more risks and stop investing where it's safe. For the longest time, even interacting with the SE, I've always had that the numbers are not great in Africa, the numbers are not great in Latin America, so let's put our money in these places and build on information dissemination and education, which is a wrong approach. I think we need to see more literature on research done by our local professors, our local folks that work at the coffee research. So another thing that I think I've been trying to push for is having more agronomically focused work put out there on just the facts about the types of varieties in Kenya and why we're developing and why we work the way we work. People have demonized the Kenyan auction for years, not understanding what it does and how it works, because people just take it on surface level and then demonize how the auction system works. Whereas I know there's advantages to how the coffee auction works. As a trader, I've seen those advantages. I like the data it presents, and I like, just having Kenyan coffees accessible to me the way they're presented, but also as a trader, you take the extra step to go learn about your producer and invest more in them. And I think in this regard, I think education is a three-pronged strategy here. We need to educate importers and roasters who buy our coffee. Producers need access to this education. And then consumers also need education. So I would say from an empathetic point of view, there is inequities in all directions, but I think some people have chosen ignorance because they do have access to this information, but they refuse to learn, and that's the Western world. And I think the burden should not fall on private sector or, the people that, buy the coffee and everything. I think government plays a role, and also the bodies that we look up to within the coffee sector, be it the SCA, be it all those folks that put out programs where we have to pay hefty amounts of money to get accreditation. They owe it to the folks that are not getting what they need to get. So I hope for the next generation of young people that we can do a better job. But I think if each of us takes it upon ourselves to make some noise, positive noise, do something radical, then we're in a better place. So we move on to the Q&A section. Shatira, I think there's a question from Will Ross. I think this should be for anyone. Interested to find out about social capital / connections and what is doing to enable producer end of the supply chain to visit consumer countries. Seem like travel direction is dominated by buyers visiting farms and not in reverse. So I don't know. Who wants to
That
take
about farmers visiting here, visiting like the cafes maybe?
Yeah, I think that's what he means. Like, it's travel is one way, not, bi-directional.
Yeah.
And yeah.
I mean, I think about that in terms of like traceability or sort of knowing where your coffee comes from is a very one-way path. Like it's important to consumers, and I always want to know who these consumers are to which this is important, because consumers also get very flattened as a group. And so you can, there are a lot of different companies that will put all kinds of really awesome information and, pictures and videos, and you can go find all this stuff out, but you don't get them in reverse, right? Like, so, but with thinking about technology, something like WhatsApp, when it is working, is actually really great for some of that, because the group that I work with in Honduras, they do have, it's not quite the same as a visit, because there's all sorts of challenges involved with that, but they'll get videos that some of the buyers, the roasters will make of the cafe or of the roastery or of people talking about it, and so there's at least some attempt to have some of that back and forth, which is not the same as a trip, but it's a lot cheaper than doing that. And then going to something like, one of the big expos, I've been at some of those panels where, you know, some entity has brought in farm workers or producers who wouldn't normally get to attend, and they're just like, why is there so much money at this show? Why? And like in this space and in these like stands and all these like crazy displays and all these sorts of things, and like, where's mine? And like, why am I not getting any of this? So I don't know if that answers the question, but it's a thought I have about it.